Okay, our Torah portion tonight is Yitro, which we always say Jethro, which always makes me think of Beverly Hillbillies for some reason. But Yitro, of course, you hear yoter in the word, which means more. Like if something is yoter tov, it means it's not just good tov, it means it's yoter tov, it's better. And so it sometimes has that meaning of something being added, something extra. And in this case, Moses' father-in-law was a good something extra. He came along with some very good advice. So I'm going to read a pretty long portion out of the Torah portion. So I will go ahead and do a blessing. But before we get too far down the road here, I want to let you know how the next couple of weeks are going to go. I will be flying out to Israel Wednesday, B'ezrat Hashem. We'll be trying to get the park ready for the archaeologists to come next week. And so next Monday night, Rabbi Krieger will be teaching the class. And we're also going to send out an invitation to the Tuesday class to join you on Monday night. And so you will have Mishpatim, is the Torah portion next week, with Rabbi Krieger, which kind of grieves me a little bit because that is my portion. I just had a birthday, so it's my Torah portion, but it'll be a good thing because then I can listen to the recording and be blessed by listening to somebody else teach it for a change. But there's a lot of good information in Mishpatim. I'm not sure what she'll go over with you. But as I was reading through it today, just to look ahead, I could see that it really is an extension of what I want to cover tonight in Yitro. Because what I want to cover in Yitro, it goes back to the 10 words, the 10 commandments. And then, of course, when you move into the next Torah portion, Mishpatim, you realize there's way more than 10. There's bunches and bunches and bunches. And it's in the unique wording of what Adonai tells Moses. He says, you know, when I give you these commandments, this Torah, this, and it's that point you realize, okay, yeah, I always knew that there had to have been some sort of differentiation because there's 5 books of Torah, but there's only 10 commandments. And so what is the Torah? Is it the 5 books or is it the 10 commandments? And the answer, of course, is yes. But it's in the unique wording, and she may go over that with you next week, or we can look at it. But that's the plan. You'll just have Monday night class next week. The following week, I'll still be in Israel. And if I don't think there's going to be a good Wi-Fi connection enough to where I could have class, then I will email you. And what I will probably try to do is move the class to Thursday. I get back on Wednesday at some point. So if I can move the class to Thursday, we can once again invite everybody into the same class on Thursday night. And we'll cover the Torah portion. I'm not sure what it is that far ahead. I think it's Teruma. And it may not be as deep and as extensive as we normally go into the Torah portion. If I have lots of good things to tell you about the archaeological dig. I've already looked at like an overview of it, and I can see it's about the building of the Mishkan. And I can already see there's potential there because of the location of Tamar, which is at this intersection of the incense route or the spice route. Everything the Israelites would have needed to build the Mishkan would have passed through that area. I mean, it's right there. So if it's porpoise skins, you can get those coming up from Eilat. If it's spices, you can get those coming up from Arabia, from Sheba, from Dedan. If you need wool, of course, they not only had their own sheep, but they've got lots of grazing, both on this side of the Jordan, that side of the Jordan. They've got dyes that can be brought up if it's from the sea snails. The copper is literally right there where they're camping in the Sin wilderness. We looked up and saw a seam the last time we were there where a piece of the mountain had fallen off, and you could literally see the green streak going across the mountain. The copper they needed for the Mishkan, the exchange of gold and silver along that route, literally everything was at their feet. It would have been easier to assemble all the building materials for the Mishkan right there where they were in the wilderness than if they'd been in Jerusalem, because that would have been an added trip. You would have to get over the Scorpion's Ascent, you would have additional travel days. And so it was really making the best of a bad situation. And so that's the way we have to see our exile sometimes. When it feels like we're in exile, we're in the wrong place, we haven't reached the destination, and we just knew that we would be there within a few days, right? But actually, sometimes he places us in a situation where he can do what he needs to do with us in a way that's actually much more convenient than we thought. It's actually a better plan than probably we would have started with. And I've found that to be true in hindsight. It's just not pleasant knowing that when you're right in the middle of it and you wish you were farther along the route at that stage of life. But at any rate, that's the plan for the next 2 weeks. And then we'll be back on schedule until probably Passover, when we'll have to think it over again. I wish there was a way we could do a live stream from Israel at Passover. I'm going to think about that and see what can be done in that location. But I don't know that we can, but we're going to give it a try. So we'll do the Torah blessing first, since we're going to read. Baruch hu atah Adonai hamevorach, Baruch Adonai hamevorach leolam va'ed, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah. Amen. Okay. Okay, we'll start with Exodus 19:3. Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples. For the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." And going on to verse 7. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words which the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." And Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will come to you in a thick cloud, so that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe in you forever." Then Moses told the words of the people to the Lord. The Lord also said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments, and let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. You shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, beware that you do not go up on the mountain or touch the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot through. Whether beast or man, he shall not live. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people, and they washed their garments. He said to the people, be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman. So it came about on the third day, when it was morning, that there were thunder and lightning flashes and a thick cloud upon the mountain and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. When the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torat emet, v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Amen. Okay. So we have lots of thunder and lightning going on here tonight. And that's basically where I want to go with this tonight and tomorrow. What I have is not really a complicated lesson. It's not a deep lesson in the Torah. And what you're going to see in it is just like it seems to be a reassimilation of a lot of the ideas that we've looked at over the past 2 to 3 years. Again, pulling in some information from Revelation, understanding that to a Jewish person, if you say the Revelation, you're not talking about the book of Revelation. You're talking about this right here. You're talking about the giving of the Torah at Sinai. They perceive that as a rapturous experience, an ecstatic experience, a mystical experience where the common person, no matter who you were, if you were standing under the mountain, you were experiencing the same ecstasy as, say, a designated prophet of God. You were experiencing the same thing right then as Moses was. And so when you look at John's revelation, then the fact that he's seeing such otherworldly, mystical symbols and so forth, that he is in some sort of state of ecstasy, as he describes at the beginning of the book of Revelation, then it makes perfect sense when we put it back into the context of what he as a Jew would have considered the revelation. And so what he's seeing in that context is not too unusual, because that's what we've realized as we've worked these last 2 or 3 years, is how much of Revelation really is decoded by the Torah itself, especially in the Exodus from Egypt. So we're going to, again, keep reminding ourselves of some of the parallels between this revelation and John's revelation. But I also want to look at the essence of it, and this is what I hope maybe you'll see next week in Mishpatim, is what an extension of the 10 Commandments it is. Because we, in this Torah portion, we get the big 10, right? 10 basics. Anybody can do the 10 basics. Few people do, but anybody can. You know, it's kind of like Ratatouille. Chef Cousteau says anybody can cook, but not everybody should. And that would probably be not everybody that should. But anybody can do the Big Ten because they're just not that hard to understand. Now, is the Shabbat thing misconstrued sometimes? Yes, but not typically out of rebellion or wickedness, typically out of misunderstanding. And so those are the Big Ten. But as you go into Mishpatim next week, they become extensive and they become difficult to understand. And I know that because that's my Torah portion. And I'm thinking, wow, this is a hard one. Why couldn't I get a nice Joseph story or something? I like stories. But Mishpatim, what you're going to see is the essence of it really goes all the way back to the garden, not just back to the Big Ten. If we look at the Big Ten, so many of those have to do with taking things or crossing boundaries that are not your own. That's not yours. In other words, you have an allotment. You have a portion. As individuals, each of us has been assigned a portion in the Torah. Things that we're obligated to do, and then things that are optional for us to do. The hard part is staying out of somebody else's business. When we start getting into their territory, when we encroach upon something that belongs to someone else, and it's not being given to us, we're simply encroaching upon it, on that territory. If you think of things like, okay, stealing is easy. You're not supposed to take things that are not yours, but you're not supposed to covet. You're not supposed to even want to get into things that aren't yours. You're not supposed to commit adultery. You're not supposed to have a relationship with someone who is not yours. You're not to have any other gods. Those are not yours to worship. You have one. And as you go through that list, you realize how the essence of each one of them, even honoring your mother and father, it's for you to honor them above other mothers and fathers. And so in some way, each of those sets a boundary, and the temptation is for us to move those boundaries. And once we do that, then of course we've committed a transgression. So let me go back to the screen share now that we kind of know where we're going. And I'm going to go ahead and admit up front what really provoked this is a couple weeks ago, I guess. It was brought to my attention that somebody was verbatim teaching workbook 1 and workbook 5 as if he thought it all up by himself. No credit given, no references, no citations, no, this is where I got this. And of course, people are going to spot it because some of those things are pretty unique to the creation gospel. And so having to confront the gentleman about it, and I think I was just more than anything disappointed that people, when we think we're on the same page with people, we find out that they're not even on the Big Ten page, much less the details pages of Mishpatim. And I'm thinking, you know what, if we can't get the Big Ten right, how in the world will we digest Mishpatim? How in the world will we differentiate between a Hebrew servant and a servant from the nations to understand, there's really a lot of nuances in Mishpatim. If you don't know which particular status the person is in, some of it comes across as pretty harsh. Or something can come across as being like forever and ever, amen, when actually it could only last either until the end of that 7-year period, or 6 years going out at 7 years, or it could never last longer than the Jubilee. And so you read some of that stuff, and especially like the slaves, like, you want to be a slave forever? Well, he's not allowed to be. By Torah, you're not allowed to be. And so understanding those finer points of interaction, I think, but you know what, if we can't even refrain from stealing from people of like mind, you know, we need to go back to the fundamentals. And so this is what we're looking at here with the Big Ten. We're looking at the fundamentals. So let's go back. And again, this is where we're going. Sometimes on this journey, where we're trying to walk in the Torah, we're acquiring so much new information every day. At some point, if you're normal, you're going to feel overwhelmed by how much you have to learn. And I'm encouraged. If you ever feel overwhelmed by how much you have to learn, then I'm encouraged. I think the danger is when we feel like we don't have anything left to learn and we think we have it all nailed down. That's a dangerous person to be around. But we do. We feel this sense of overwhelm. And sometimes when we're overwhelmed, we can tend to shut down a little bit. We can tend to become numb to things. And I think that's where the danger comes in of falling into a routine. Because, you know, that's a habit I'll do. If I've been studying intensively for days on end, there comes a point where my brain just needs to shut down and do mindless things that I don't have to think about too much. Now, of course, in the summertime, cycling does that. But your brain is not designed. That's what, you know, the scripture says, you know, the study of much words is wearying. And so you have to have that balance. But as we find that balance, what I don't want is for us to ever think of the commandments or speak of the commandments without acknowledging the tremendous power that is within these words that we use. If we can put ourselves in the shoes, just like at Pesach, put ourselves in the, well, we probably wouldn't have our shoes on, put ourselves in the position of the Israelites at the mountain and imagine what you would be feeling if you saw this lightning, if you saw the flames of fire, if you heard the thunder, the voice of Adonai is thunder, if you were feeling the earthquake under your feet with every utterance, if you could literally see the words, which is what the text says, they saw the word. If you're experiencing all this, you're never going to forget it. Never. You could never forget something like that. I mean, it would probably be 10 times more frightening than being in front of a tornado, you know, or being in the path of a hurricane. Think of any natural disaster, and these are the same forces that are being brought to bear with the giving of the Torah. And at that point, you're not sure if you're holy enough, you're going to survive it. In fact, according to tradition, you didn't. You got killed with every utterance, and he had to revive you. He had to resurrect you and bring you back until they were begging Moses, you know, we can't hear anymore. This, you know, being struck dead by the word and coming back alive again. We're human. We can't last through this. You go talk to him, Moses, and then you bring the words back. So whether that's true or not, if you can think of what that experience would have been like. And so here we are, you know, every Monday night or every Tuesday afternoon, we're sitting here, we're studying the Torah, we're trying to, you know, break the words apart, see what they mean, put them back together, put them with other passages. And it's easy to get lost in the information. But then all of a sudden we get out in the world and sometimes we feel impotent to speak with the same joy that we speak when, say, we are with like kind and like mind. We get out into the world and it loses some of the thunder. We might talk about the commandments, but we don't speak with the same thunder. And that's what Yeshua noticed and pointed out to his disciples. Like, dudes, you're going to need power to do what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to speak these words with thunder as if you were there at Sinai. And then what he provides for them is a Sinai experience in Acts chapter 2. And so that part of who we are in Messiah, we can't forget that. We can't get so caught up in debates and analysis and learning Hebrew and all these wonderful things that help us bring more thunder, because it gives us more confidence, it gives us more boldness, because we can speak about the text with much more authority as we study. But with that boldness, I think we cannot forget the thunder. You know, how did you feel when you first knew that this was real? Then it was more than just stories. Then it was more than just words in an old book. When you knew that the Father was speaking to you directly through his word, and you felt that shot of electricity, you felt that rapture, that ecstasy. You know, we all react differently. Maybe you wanted to run around the house. Maybe you wanted to run around a church. I don't know where you were, what you were doing when it happened to you. When you figured out the Shabbat, and the joy and the mystery and the excitement and the curiosity of learning about how to keep the Shabbat. Those were days of thunder for us. Those were days of lightning, when a new commandment that we never thought applied to us, and all of a sudden now we apply it to our lives, and it's like that bolt of lightning coming down in our hearts. You know, it's like getting hooked up to one of those lightning machines in the emergency room. It's a joy, it's an ecstasy. And so that's what this lesson is about to me. How are we going to hold on to these words with thunder? Not just with routine, not just as information, but to begin to speak not just with one another where it's safe, but to begin to go boldly out into the world where we have an impact, whether it's friends, family, work, neighborhood, whatever it might be, to go out there. And we don't have to speak arrogantly, but I want us to start speaking with thunder, with that same sense of awe, of reverence, of belonging. What he's gathering us to is the body of Messiah. And even though you might stick out like a sore thumb where you are right now, you have to understand he's gathering you as a body. And you can be confident in that. So we're back to the wilderness here. That was my exhortation, or whatever we call that. Even Uzi sat up. It must have been unpleasant for him. He's like, less thunder, please. I'm trying to sleep. But we see that as they're going into the wilderness is a particular environment that he has chosen. And this wilderness is so important that it forms their character within the Torah that Moses is teaching them for 40 years. I mean, it's being tested in a furnace because that place does get hot. And then when we get to John's revelation, we realize the same thing is happening because the woman, Israel, is given the wings of a great eagle and taken out into the wilderness to nourish her. It says for a time and times and half the time. The idea being is the wilderness is actually a place where he wants to protect us until it's time for the next stage of the plan. And the wilderness is a special place. And one thing is when you get out into the wilderness, particularly this wilderness that they are in, there aren't a lot of animals. There's not, a huge number. I'm putting together a booklet that has all like the birds and the wolves and leopards and stuff like that. And then the trees and the particular nature of the Teen Wilderness, where they were basically groomed to be able to cross over for 40 years. But once you're there, you start to learn the character and the nature of the creatures that are in that place. And as I was putting this little manual, just handy reference manual together for people who will visit the park down there to know what kind of birds they're looking at or snakes or whatever, I realized that if you take each of these animals has some strange quality, not strange, but special. There's something special about it. And you think, that's odd. If you take the best of these qualities and put them together, you have an ideal human being. Now, if you took the worst of their qualities, you don't have the ideal human being. But each one of them, they have some unique little trait. And for the eagle, what I noticed, and of course it's mentioned in the text, he says, I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. And we all know the story about how the parent eagles will swoop up under their young as they're learning how to fly and support them on their backs. And of course, the rabbis commented that if hunters were to shoot arrows up at them, then basically the parent eagle is putting himself or herself between the arrow and the eaglet. But in this particular environment, what I realized is that eagles kill snakes. That's important in the wilderness because there are harmless snakes in the wilderness, like the racers. The racers are pretty harmless. But there are several types of vipers. And if you get bitten by a viper, it's not a good thing. And so as I was researching the eagle, and I was watching, if you have not seen the series, they're running it free right now. You can get it on Hulu. The series is called Wild Israel. And two of the programs, Program 1 and Program 2, are centered around the Negev and the Arava and the Dead Sea. They're just awesome resources. I use that putting this little manual together. So I did a little more research. They had the giant golden eagle on there that's down in the Arava. So I did a little more research and I found out that the eagles will kill snakes. It did go into detail about how they keep the snakes from biting them. I'm not really sure. It didn't have that much information, but it makes sense as he's making this parallel to Israel. He says, okay, you saw what I did to the Egyptians. That's going to come up here in a little bit, especially when we get into Acts chapter 2 and what the people were saying when they were speaking with the tongues of fire. But this will be the specific quote that we'll go back to. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Okay, that's pretty fantastic. Whether the language is intentionally poetic or whether it's literal, like somehow there were eagle's wings beneath Israel as he performed the judgments upon the Egyptians, and then how he brought them out into the wilderness. The idea being that the snake, remember the signs and miracles begin with the snake. Moses and Aaron, they've got a staff, they throw it down, it turns into a snake, and then their snake eats Egypt's snake, the true snakes, the venomous snakes. The venom of the snake or the venom of the serpent is in his words. That's how the snake works, with words. So when he's taking them out into the wilderness on eagle's wings, it's more than just a beautiful picture. What he's saying is, I protected you from the words of the Egyptians, because that's how they do damage. When you're in a state of slavery, especially, it's easy to say, well, it's my physical circumstances, when actually Words have created the condition for you to even be in slavery. All through history, people have even taken words of the Bible as justification for slavery. So how were the slaves created? Originally, they were created with words, with ideas, with beliefs, with doctrines, twisted, but that's how it created a condition of slavery. So he said, I protected you like an eagle in the wilderness would destroy a snake. I bore you on eagle's wings so I could bring you to myself. So, okay, now we're going to advance. And that's why I read this passage from Shemot 19. I wanted to get in your head the image of that quaking mountain, the thunder, the lightning, and the fire. And I wanted you to think about the 3 days of preparation, because we're going to comment on that too eventually. But as we're reading these words, another detail we need in the back of our minds is that the rabbis say when this occurred, when this smoke is coming up like out of a furnace at the giving of the Torah, that when the voice started going out, that the Torah was offered to the 70 nations of the earth. And of course, we know out of the 70, only one said, we will do and we will hear. Only one accepted. And of course, that nation was Israel, and that's what sets Israel as a people apart from every other people, is this behavior, this attitude, this obedience of saying, we will do and we will hear. And so, let's see, let's skip forward here. We've got the trumpet sound, we've got the cloud, we've got all the conditions of Rosh Hashanah, actually. But I want us to think about that context. And even though Israel was the only nation at Sinai that said, we will do and we will hear. And according to the rabbis, the rest of the nations just thought it was too onerous. It would be too hard. It'd just be too much trouble to do those commandments. And of course, not a whole lot has changed. But even the composition of the Sanhedrin, remember, it's 70 plus 1. The 70 that comprised the Sanhedrin represented the nations. We think they represented Israel. They didn't. They represented Israel to the nations. And then that extra one was, of course, the one that's going to represent Israel. So from the beginning, there's been a plan to rectify this right here. Well, Israel is saying we will do and we will hear, and the nations are saying we won't and we don't. There's still going to be a plan put in place to go out among them and once again make an offer. And that's actually what you're seeing in the book of Revelation that John is seeing. He is seeing a last chance offer to the nations. And if they will not repent, if they will not do and hear, then these plagues are going to come. And so that's why you see similar language. Like they saw the smoke like a furnace ascending at the mountain. They experienced earthquakes at the mountain. They heard the thunders. They heard the voices at the mountain. They saw the consuming fire that didn't consume things on the mountain. They heard the trumpet blasts at the mountain. They understood that both man and beast would suffer if they tried to touch the mountain before the appointed time. So you've got this same juxtaposition of man and beast as you do in Revelation. And then there's a particular type of judgment that's going to occur if they were to break through and touch the mountain before it was time, before they were told they could ascend. He says they're going to be shot through or stoned, but your hand shall not touch them. And I had for many years read that as, Moses would see somebody go up and touch the mountain and tell, Joshua or somebody, shoot them with an arrow, or, hey, everybody pick up a stone and throw at them. But that's not what it's saying. No hand is going to be laid on them. What they would actually experience would be what John is describing. And so John is actually kind of an explanation of what we're seeing right here in chapter 19. Because remember, the white horse rider, as the judgments begin in the book of Revelation, the first rider you see is the rider of the white horse, and he's carrying a bow. What will he do? Well, he's going to shoot some people through if he has to, depending on their state of holiness and where they're trying to stand. And the other way they were going to, it was like, they shall be stoned. And remember, the condition is don't touch them. You don't need to, because the Spirit's going to take care of the judgment. We don't need a human being to take care of this judgment. It's just going to happen. And so again, the stones, we get this expression in the book of Revelation where the people who wouldn't repent, it says they're hiding in the rocks and the caves of the mountains, saying, rocks, fall on us. And basically, you don't have to stone them. The rocks will fall on them of their own accord. Because remember, rocks are pretty obedient. Yeshua said the rocks will cry out if the human beings don't. If the human beings don't take care of judgment, then the rocks will fall on them. That's coming. So, going back to our day at the mountain here, in Jewish tradition and calculation, the giving of the Torah and the celebration of Shavuot are going to occur on the same day. And so once they move into the land itself, when the condition is there has to be a majority of Israel that's living inside the land for this particular commandment to go into effect. And they're moving in that direction right now in terms of demographics. It's just a matter of time till there's more Jews in Israel than anywhere else in the world. And the last time I checked, the opinion was that those who bring the first fruits today, in whatever manner they can, considering there's no temple, they are obeying a rabbinic commandment. At the point when a majority of Israel or a majority of Jews return to the land, at that point, it's going to activate the Torah commandment itself. Right? Because see, when you can't literally do something, if there's no temple, if there's no functioning priesthood, or if you don't live in Israel, when it comes to a commandment, you have to figure out how to remember and to guard it. Well, you can't literally do it. So you have to figure out some way. All right. And, study is one way. When you can't literally do a commandment, you can still study the commandment. That's a way of remembering it and guarding it. But at the point where literally those people are in the land, it moves from being a rabbinic enactment into a state of a literal Torah commandment that needs to be obeyed by everyone, every landowner. So inside Israel, you're going to commemorate the giving of the Torah by bringing the first fruits of the wheat at Shavuot. But before that's ever enacted by the nation, before that, what precedes the first fruits of the wheat is the giving of the Torah. And that's important, especially when you start looking at the readings. If you compare like this week's readings and the Shavuot readings, there's a lot of discussion as to why this Haftorah, but not that Haftorah, but then this Haftorah over here. And it has to do with this question right here. Basically, which came first? First came the giving of the Torah. They would not have known the specifics of how to bring the bikurim of the wheat unless they had first received the Torah. Now, let's say in Abraham's case, we know he brought tithes. To do that, there's a general principle, but there's no written commandment. There's some sort of knowledge. You know, we have them, you know, with this behavior, like observing nidah, bringing tithes. They're doing things, levirate marriage, before the actual writing of the Torah. At the point where it's written and they agree, now it's binding upon the nation. So we have this order. And of course, why is the Bechor or the Bikurim important? It's going to represent something in an agricultural sense that it should be true in a spiritual sense. With the giving of the Torah, we have an entire nation, fathers, mothers, children, grandparents, grandchildren. We have extended generations, all standing under the mountain, receiving the Torah. And therefore, you could literally see the extension of the agreement through generations. So how do we remember that with thunder? Right? If we weren't there. But when you celebrate the first fruits of the wheat, you understand that it's bikurim. And in human terms, the bechor is that extension of the father into the next generation. And so the first fruit belongs to two generations. Remember, like Joseph, they said he belonged to the previous generation. Even though he was in his brother's generation, he fit more in with the previous. And that's the idea of the bikurim, is that they're the replica, that extension of the Father's will into the next generation. And this is the most important thing about the Torah. This is, you know, what we get with the Shema that we're going to say twice a day. We don't stop with Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. We go into the full Shema, where it talks about how you need to actually incise these commandments into your children. You need to transplant the seed of the word into your children. You need to plant it into the next generation. You are not simply to receive this Torah, you are to ensure that this Torah is planted into the next generation, that it is extended into a first fruit. And so in that, throughout every generation, then you can transfer the thunder. And that's got to be the hardest thing in the world for a parent, for a teacher, is to do more than just pass along the words and the rules and the regulations and the routines. But how do you teach those things to a child with the original thunder of Sinai? With the original trembling and wondering if the mountain's going to drop on top of your head, wondering if you're going to get hit by a lightning bolt or if the flames are going to eat you up. Now, we don't want to terrify our children with the Torah. We're not commanded to do that. But we need to transfer that sense of awe into our children for the commandments, because we're in such a huge battle at this moment with moral relativism. In other words, human beings make up their own rules, and because they're good, they take precedence over biblical rules because they have their own definition of goodness. Well, by definition, if Adonai did not pronounce it good, it's not. It's all relative. And we're going to look at what distinguishes these commandments that were received at Sinai, when they really resemble commandments of so many other nations. there's not probably any culture you're going to go into where they're going to say it's okay to murder and steal from one another. That's just a moral imperative that crosses cultures. There has to be something happening here at Sinai that sets it apart from the morals of every other nation. Of course, it's going to be who gave it. But we actually have 3 opportunities to extend this into the next generation. And so we can get caught up, like I say, in the rules, the regulations, the information, the having fun or whatever, because they are associated with seasons of agriculture. But that does make them ideal teaching opportunities. Because at Pesach, we know we have to tell that story of the Passover as if we were literally in it, because we were. And we are. And we will be again at another Exodus. So we teach that first fruits of salvation from death. The best time to teach salvation from death is going to be at Passover. Once your children understand that Egypt represents death, then when better to pass into them what it would have felt like. You see, even though we say, well, we don't depend on feelings, we don't let feelings guide us, but our feelings are part of who we are. And this is one of those places where you can appeal to your feelings, to your emotions, and say, okay, look, time for you to jump in, all right? Because too many times they're wanting us to jump in with them with emotions that simply are not based on it is written. It's just based on I feel. Well, here is what is written. Therefore, we tell our soul, I want you to feel something about this. I want you to experience the terror of the plagues, the wondering what's going to happen next, and then the absolute awesome wonder of being separated from Egypt during those last plagues, of leaving with our first taste of freedom in many generations at Passover, of walking into the clouds of glory at Sukkot, of crossing the Reed Sea, of seeing the Egyptian army destroyed, of singing songs of praise and worship. All these things you can extend into your children in a strong way at Pesach. And then at Shavuot, you've got the first fruits of the barley there. That's agricultural. With the first fruits of the wheat, you have the opportunity to explain, well, where did even this agricultural thing come from? It comes from the Torah. And so it was at Shavuot. There was the giving, there was the receiving of the Torah, and it came in a cloud. And so now we have the instructions that tell us, now that we're out of death, and we're getting ready to pass into life on the wings of a great eagle, now we need to understand how to live in the cloud. These are our instructions. And they can hear the thunder and see the lightning. We pass that on. That's the first fruits of the wheat. And then at Sukkot, of course, you can bring from the wine vat, from the threshing floor, from flock, herd, fruit of the ground, fruit of the tree. You get first fruits of a bunch of stuff that you can celebrate at Sukkot. Yes, it's still agricultural, but you understand at this point, you're still dwelling in the glory of the cloud, because actually the cloud enveloped you when you left Egypt, and it never left you, as long as you didn't rebel. When you rebelled, the cloud withdrew, and then that left you exposed to the snakes and the scorpions and the Amalekites and all the other stuff. But if you remained obedient, if you could remember the awe, the thunder, the lightning, the glory of being in the presence of Adonai, then he protected you like a great eagle in the wilderness. from anybody that would throw the venom of the words at you to confuse you. And so you have kind of this idea of the fire extending from feast to feast to feast. And that fire of the Torah was extended to the nations. So here's what we read from Acts chapter 2, verse 1. It says, when the day of Pentecost, which is Shavuot, had come, they were all together in one place, just one. And suddenly there came from heaven a noise like a violent rushing wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. So that would give you the impression that something revelatory was about to happen, because you're starting to get the violence, the rushing wind that they experienced at Sinai. And there appeared to them tongues as of fire distributing themselves, and they rested on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit was giving them utterance. So again, just the way that they saw fire on the mountain at the giving of the Torah, all of a sudden now the fire comes and distributes itself on them. And then they were filled with the Holy Spirit. In other words, they began to experience the fire and the thunder and the lightning of the giving of the Torah. Now there were Jews living in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven. Okay, here's where the restoration component comes in. Every nation under heaven. And when this sound occurred, the crowd came together. What sound? Remember, at Sinai, they saw the sounds. That's what the text says. They saw the sounds. They saw the utterances of the 10 Commandments. And it goes back to the opening passage that we read, where he says, you saw what I did to the Egyptians, and you saw how I bore you on eagle's wings. There's a context here. And when this sound occurred, the crowd came together and were bewildered, because each one of them was hearing them speak in his own language, which is exactly what the rabbis say. When the Torah was offered to the nations, it was offered to them in their own tongues. They were amazed and astonished, saying, why are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we each hear them in our own language to which we were born? Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the districts of Libya around Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them in our own tongues, speaking of the mighty deeds of God. That's what's important. Speaking of the mighty deeds of God. Whatever they were saying, they were speaking of the mighty deeds of God. My guess is that we know the exact text of what they heard. And that's what it says. There appeared to them tongues as of fire, distributing themselves, and they rested on each one of them. They were all filled with the Holy Spirit, began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit was giving them utterance. Exodus 20:18 tells us, all the people saw the thunder and the lightning and the flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. Okay, so there's going to be a slight change here. Instead of being disinterested in what they hear, these representatives from the nation are going to come together and be interested in what they saw and what they heard. And these are the things that accompany the thunder, the lightning, the flashes, the fire, the sound of the trumpet, the mountain smoking. They're going to hear all that, but they're also going to see it. And here's what Moses said to the people. Do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, and in order that the fear of him may remain with you, so that you may not sin. All right, this is what Moses is saying. There's thunder, there's lightning, there's earthquakes, there's fire, there's the rushing mighty winds. It would have to have been terrifying, because I think in those moments you would realize your own sin in ways that you don't on a normal day. Right? It's in prayer and introspection sometimes that we realize, oh wow, I wasn't really even ready to come into prayer right now. Let me go back and work on some things. Let me go into a state of repentance here, and then we can continue this. At that point, they've had 3 days of preparation. But even after all these signs go away, when the thunder goes away, when the lightning goes away, when the fire and the smoke go away, when the earthquakes go away, Moses is telling him this same reverence that you're feeling for him right now, when you fear for your life, it needs to remain with you. He says, so that you may not sin. So they were to reverence his word even after the terror of the moment left. They were to remain in that state of thunder. And Art Scroll actually translates this differently. Where Moses says, for God has come in order to test you, they're translating that word in order to exalt you instead of test you. And Rashi comments on this, why he's reading exalt instead of test. And I wouldn't have thought too much about it until I made the connection to Acts chapter 2 as the rectification of the nations rejecting the Torah at Sinai. So Rashi writes, in order to exalt you means to promote you throughout the world so that your reputation will go out among the nations, in that he in his glory revealed himself to you. In other words, what has happened to you here is so astounding that it's going to give you the ability throughout the world to maintain a reputation of thunder. Because when you have the word of glory in you, when he has revealed his glory to you, then how can you be in the world and not have a reputation that his glory has been revealed to you? See, that's what's going to distinguish you as a receiver of laws and judgments and commandments as different from any other person in any other nation who has also received commandments not to murder, not to rob, not to steal, not to commit adultery. They have their own moral laws. So what is to make Israel, what is to make us different from every other moral law? And Moses is telling us right here that the fear of him may remain with you. See, he gives you these commandments, yes, to exalt you, but only for the purpose of revealing his glory through you. So that when people see you, the commandments that you keep, you were so utterly transformed by the commandment, do not murder, do not steal, that there's nobody else under any other law in the world that's going to shine the beauty of do not murder, do not steal, like you can. He's going to build your reputation with his glory. The fact that he revealed himself to you in thunder, if that will remain with you, then it is going to exalt you. Not for the purpose of raising your self-esteem, not for the purpose of making you look good for your own purposes, but for the purpose of revealing the glory that he revealed to you to the nations. And that's what the listeners in Acts 2 could hear. It says the disciples were speaking of the mighty deeds of God. What had he just done? Like Rashi said, he had promoted them. There was something different going on in Solomon's porch that day than normally went on. It's not that they weren't reading the Torah any other day. It's not that they weren't speaking about the Torah any other day. They were. That's what the temple was for. But something had so utterly transformed them, the fire came down. They saw the sounds. The tongues rested on them, and it did not consume them. And this is what Moses says to the people. Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So what would the disciples have been proclaiming? I think exactly this. What he did to the Egyptians and how he brought an entire nation out on eagle's wings and brought them to himself to be a people at Mount Sinai and gave them the commandments, the ordinances, the precepts that would set them apart from any other nation who might even have identical commandments and precepts. And it parallels what John is saying. It says the two wings of a great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place where she was nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. How could he do that? He envelops her in a cloud. That's the original context. He brings them into the cloud, into the wilderness. And if they're obedient, if they're living with words of thunder, then they are nourished from the presence of the serpent. When they start rebelling, when they start complaining, when they're unhappy, when they challenge the leadership, when they hate the food, that's when the cloud withdraws. And that's when the serpent can start shooting the venom of words and begin to confuse them. Because some of this is wrapped up in the idea of that sila, that supernatural bug that comes up out of the abyss. And we know that the tails of the horses is like serpents, and it says the power to wound is in their mouths and it's in their tails. It's in the serpents. That's where his power to wound is. And so, let me see if this is where I need to stop. That's not really where I wanted to stop, but I guess I should because of time.